I'm excited to announce our next speaker, Vilas Dhar. Vilas Dhar is president and trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, a 21st century philanthropy advancing AI and data solutions to create a thriving, equitable, and sustainable future for all. A trained computer scientist, lawyer, and philanthropist, Vilas holds a JD from NYU School of Law, a master's in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and dual bachelor's degrees in biomedical engineering and computer science from the University of Illinois. He is currently completing his doctoral dissertation at the University of Birmingham, where his research drives novel approaches to economic and policy infrastructure for a data-enabled society to support and empower vulnerable populations. Vilas is joined by Jules de Boinville, head of UK deployments at scale. Julia, over to you.
Hi everyone, and welcome to TransformX's Fireside Chat with Vilas Dhar. Vila, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Julia. I'm so excited to be in the conversation with you.
And where are you dialing in from today?
You know, today I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. This summer has found me all over the world, but it's nice to be back home for a couple of days.
I can imagine. So for those of you who don't know, Vilas Dhar is president and trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, a 21st century philanthropy advancing AI and data solutions to create a thriving, equitable, and sustainable future for all. A leading voice on equity in a tech-enabled world, Vilas champions individuals and communities as architects, decision makers, and primary stakeholders in shaping our digital future. Vilas, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you today. Please tell us a little bit about you and how you entered into this space.
Oh, thanks so much, Jules. As I said, it's a delight to be with you. So thanks for that very kind intro. But I think maybe a way to encapsulate it and make it even shorter is I'm driven by a single purpose. I have a sense that the world can be a better place, that technology can really empower us to be our most creative, our most humane selves. But I'm also convinced that that won't necessarily happen all by itself, that we have a shared responsibility to step into a world of technology and policy and actually bring our best selves to making decisions that protect our future for everyone. I came to this work through a winding path. As you described, I was a technologist first, and I worked on early artificial intelligence, but very quickly realized that technology by itself doesn't matter. Technology that changes the way people interact with the world around them, that readjusts power structures and gives people more agency. That's really where we should focus. I spent some time in my career as a lawyer, understanding systems of power, and as a private sector entrepreneur, building companies that went on to transform how socially conscious technology might work. But all of this has led me to my current work. And to be honest with you, it's maybe not the most expected outcome for somebody with my background. But today I sit as the president of a major new philanthropy, trying to re-envision what a 21st century institution that knows and lives AI and data, but also understands the significant challenges we face. This is the background to our work, and I'm happy to share a little bit of the lessons we've learned with you today.
So Vilas, you talked about this human-centered, digitally enabled future. What is the key to this future, and what does this future look like, and what have you done to help, and what can we do to help?
Oh, I love that question, Jules. Let me take us back to basics, and I'll tell you a little story. When I was a kid, I was very lucky. I grew up near the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Champaign, Illinois. And it was kind of a fantasy place, right? I mean, I was 8 or 9 years old, and I had the chance to run through towers of Cray supercomputers. We had a 6-sided cube that was doing virtual reality almost 30 odd years ago. And I grew up steeped in the coolest technology that humanity was able to build. Well, I'll tell you that that was just one part of my life. In another part of my life, I had my family that lived in rural India. And I would go back to see them and operate in a world that didn't have even basic power or running water, basic access to healthcare. But I always wanted to be a technology ambassador, right? So I would take the coolest new tech that I could find, whether it was a video game console or a new laptop or a handheld device, I'd take it with me all the way back to India, and I'd sit with my grandfather. My grandfather was already in his 80s. He was somebody who had a third grade education, and yet was somebody who had been a hero of social movements in India. And with all of his patience and his generosity, he would sit with me as I would show him the coolest new toy. And he'd give me about 10 minutes of patient curiosity. But invariably, we'd get to the same place in that conversation. After asking me a few questions and getting me excited, he would say to me, I think this is great. And someday I hope you're somebody who builds these tools. But I need to know, how is this thing you have brought, this Game Boy or this laptop or this handheld device, able to change the lives of somebody who's out there who's trying to grow just enough rice to feed their family? How does it change the life of a child who's sitting in a classroom with no air conditioning, forget about, no computers or no digital technologies? How does it help that child learn more effectively? How does it help our people govern and create a new world? That's a story from 30 odd years ago, and it has stuck with me my entire life. And as a technologist, I often had that voice in the back of my head saying, how do we build technologies that have more than just the wow factor of building something cool, that actually fundamentally and materially change and transform human life? So with that motivation and intention behind us, again, we now have the opportunity to build an institution in the Patrick McGovern Foundation, but also a field of human-centered technology. It forces us to think about a number of different characteristics of what these technologies look like. First and foremost for me, centering the creation of tools that solve real problems that humans face. At a global level, that's thinking about things like responses to climate. How do we build technologies that are able to integrate all of the different ways that we have of understanding our planet, from geospatial intelligence and highly granular ways of understanding methane emissions, and connecting those pieces of data to the people's stories of frontline defenders who are trying to fight illegal poaching in the 150 acres that they defend in the Amazon, for example. So we're trying to build technologies that empower every single person on that value chain to do something about a problem that faces all of us. At the other end of the spectrum, oh, please, Jules.
Sorry, I was going to say, your grandfather sounds like a really special man. And if only everyone had a grandfather like that, encouraging them to have a kind of social lens as they develop different products, I think the world would be in a different place.
I absolutely agree with you. And I'll tell you, that's such a powerful comment, Jules, because, I no longer have a grandfather like that. He lives in my heart, but he's passed on. But I will tell you that just a few weeks ago, I had a chance to go and spend some time in the Lakota traditional lands of South Dakota. And we did a code camp for kids, for children between 13 and 16, to learn about AI. And I want to just tell you what these kids accomplished in 3 weeks. These were kids who had never really coded before, but in partnership with a group called Natives in Tech and taught by indigenous American scientists who focus on AI. In 3 weeks, they built an app. And here's what this app did. Of course, first of all, they built an app. That in itself is quite cool for kids who have never coded before. But the app could be taken out into the traditional lands of the Sioux Lakota people, and you could take a picture of a plant. Now, these kids had learned how to build models, what it meant to build machine learning, and they had built a model that would identify that plant. So far, we're on pretty well-trodden territory, right? But here's what else the app did. Along with giving back the name of the plant in English, it gave back the name of the plant in Lakota, a language that many of these kids didn't really speak fluently, but had a high level of interest. And one step further, what they hoped to do was build an app that would take that picture of a plant and return back a set of stories and mythologies from Lakota tradition that connected to that plant. From these youth came these ideas that to me so reflected what my grandfather always said to me, that we can build tech that connects us back to our stories, to our histories, to our cultures, that connect us back to a very sense of identity and make us better humans. So if only we all had grandfathers like the one I had, I imagine that would be an incredible blessing for humanity. But we also hear those incredible pieces of wisdom from our young people who are just learning how to use these technologies, but deeply understand what they need for the world they live in.
Wow, that's fascinating. So how old were these children that were building the app?
Yeah, they were between 13 and 16. But
Wow.
with the advent of many of the tools that we're familiar with now, from Unity to Jupyter, what I remember sitting down to code 20 odd years ago with a blank screen now is an entirely enabling environment where they can pull on models and they can pull on modules and really begin to build these things with incredibly high speed.
How do you think we can increase this kind of sense of morality around things that we develop? How do we make sure that everyone has a grandfather like yours in their mind? Do you think it's through regulation? What are the tools that we have available to us?
Yeah, I'll give you what might sound like a bit of a naive answer, Jules, but I always want to start there because I think optimism matters. That these
Agreed.
are really decisions that don't have to do with regulation. They have to do with what we prioritize as a society. I often say that for the last half of the 20th century, we gave technologists and industrialists this incredible opportunity. We said, here are shiny new earth movers and tractors and ways to build with reinforced steel. Go and build us great skyscrapers. And they built us great companies that built amazing products. But at the same time, we looked at the people who are trying to solve great human challenges, childhood malnutrition, poverty, access to health. And we gave them a set of plastic beach tools, a plastic shovel and a bucket, and said, build a sandcastle in the sand. Now, when I say I'm an optimist, I say this is a change that we can make together. That I think companies and individuals who work inside the private sector have deeply aligned moral values. And we need to change the incentives. We need to set it up so that companies understand that investing in research and development is a core function of what they do. But shared with the social sector can also build solutions to challenges like when we're trying to figure out how we do better inventory management inside of a US retail company. Many of those algorithms and the work that's being deployed against them can be used to better target vaccines in emerging health environments in Africa. That there are synergies to be found. Now, the incentives for that come from a few different places. One is all of us as consumers and customers encouraging the businesses that are providing us products to think in these ways. It comes from us as democratically inclined citizens, asking our governments to fund research and development into particularly AI tools that lead to positive social outcomes. And it comes through academics who are often at that front line of thinking about the broad ways in which technology is being developed can be deployed for the public good. It also, I think, and this is the last and maybe critical piece that speaks to my own kind of perspective on this, requires civil society to step forward and say we can be partners with technologists. That as philanthropies, we can fund organizations that do this work at scale, and that we can find ways to engage technologists in the companies that they already sit in to build new products.
And looking at initiatives like Workforce Wanted, how can we build on these? How can we spread the word and encourage others to adopt a similar approach?
Yeah, Workforce Wanted was a piece of work that we were so happy to engage in with data.org, an organization that really thinks about building data science talent and capacity inside of the communities where social change is happening. That report and the work that we did around it demonstrated some pretty key challenges, which speak to why we don't have more data scientists in the world today. Sometimes a limited set of educational environments and resources, particularly centralized in privileged settings, that bring kids into a place where they have exposure to digital technologies quite early.
Vilas, I had the honour of going to my first ever WEF at Davos this year, which was just the most incredible experience, both from a business perspective, but also all the different charities that are there, government organisations. You really can learn so much. And I've read that you've also become a young leader for the World Economic Forum, which is a huge accolade. What does that mean to you? And what does that mean for the larger story of AI in general?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Julia. So the World Economic Forum is an incredible platform for cross-sectoral collaboration. And that's really what has brought us into that world. To be a young global leader it's a very meaningful honor that advances the idea that youth can have a really significant part of our AI decision making. But more broadly, I also co-chair the Global AI Action Alliance at the World Economic Forum with Arvind Krishna, the CEO of IBM. And together, what we're trying to build is a new platform that connects private sector CEOs and technologists with social sector actors and academics in a way that means we don't have to silo our research and development, but actually to create open connection points that say, if we have figured out how to solve one problem, how do we use that solution to solve many? So what we do is a few different things. One, to work with nonprofits and social change organizations to be on a pathway to what we call data fluency and AI maturity, to be on a place where they can take, as you probably know, nonprofits have been incredible stewards of data. For tens of years, they've been collecting data about performance and efficacy and what the real world looks like down at that front line of social change. To now equip them with the tools to extract insight and meaning from that data and to do it in partnership with companies. At the same time, though, we think companies are really interested in these questions of stakeholder engagement. How do we make sure that we're integrating AI solutions into companies in ways that lead to long-term sustainable solutions? That they aren't just pilots that are happening in 50 different parts of the company, but rather have an integrated strategy, and a strategy that ties both into the long-term health of the organization, but also into the community-facing CSR efforts the company is doing, the ways in which consumer behavior is changing because of the AI strategies of companies, to really focus on boards and proper governance to make sure that we're not creating new vulnerabilities and harms. Now, these are topics that are unfortunately in the news all the time, only when something bad happens. But we think it's important to celebrate all of the incredible ways in which AI is being used in this collaboration between the private and public sectors to do really cool things. I mentioned earlier, and I'll just give you one short vignette, we're working with governments across sub-Saharan Africa to use a variety of somewhat amorphous data sets to ask the question, can we better target not just vaccines, but early interventions around health to address things like malnutrition down at a village level, sometimes even at the street level, to encourage better health outcomes for new mothers by making sure that we understand where hospitals might be failing their communities, or maybe much more importantly, where exceptional new health treatments are being deployed. So the World Economic Forum has been an incredible place for us to bring those communities together. And Jules, I'm sorry I missed you in Davos, but I hope we can be together at the next one.
I hope so. Yeah, it's interesting what you say. It's this sort of multi-sector collaboration that you are able to facilitate through WEF and similar organizations that really allow for progress. And it's in a non-competitive environment. You know, everyone's fighting for a greater good. Everyone wants the same things in that sense. So you can then collaborate with commercial competitors, if that makes sense. And I think WEF is a really good platform for that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll say one thing further, and it's important to note this, especially because I know we have many technologists in our audience. These aren't just high-flying ambitions around better collaboration. They actually are quite specific to the technologies being deployed. When we think about, we use the term foundation models, which often refers to large language models, but also in our view incorporates things like video or other data sets. I think it's worth recognizing and acknowledging that the number of institutions in the world today that can really build these large foundation models is quite limited, right? I mean, maybe on the order of a few tens or maybe a few hundreds. But those models have amazing opportunities to do incredible things in the world. And without having real connection at a technical level, without having embedded data scientists and AI engineers that are working in social change organizations, these things will just continue to grow inside of silos. So we see collaboration, again, not merely as a kind of view of how organizations interact, but also a functional mechanism for how we build new technology. That when you have direct access to the understanding of a particular data set and a particular population, a particular need, you can often provide feedback that actually serves to make models more powerful, that actually creates new value inside of the foundation model itself. And we're beginning to explore exactly what that looks like through specific collaborations that we have going with a number of institutions.
And what do you hope to achieve in Davos 2023?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for us, it'll be a continuation of what we're doing, of making sure that there is a clear communication pathway between what companies want to accomplish and the challenges we face, particularly around things like climate, where we have found that that has become a universal concern, but also a universal area of opportunity to ensure that we're lifting up great solutions and building best practices for the field, and throughout underscoring and underlying the need for ethical and responsible practices around technology.
And for our listeners, are there any sort of Fortune 500 or big blue chip companies that you think are demonstrating technology for social good in a particularly inspiring way? Who do you think is kind of leading as a good example?
Yeah, you know, the way I always like to answer that question is I think companies do some really incredible work, and we see it in the public arena. But what we should really focus on are the individuals who are leading those initiatives inside of those companies. I think about, and I mentioned a few examples earlier, right? The creation of new algorithms and models for inventory management, but also for things like sentiment sensing in call centers, right? Companies that are really deploying this at scale, but are understanding that those tools deployed into an environment, often in a non-top 100 language, can create incredible access to services. I was recently with the mayor of a large city, and we spent a lot of time talking about how that city might use new AI tools. One of the things that we quickly ascertained was they had a really significant challenge connecting the social services that the city offered to its residents to new asylum seekers or refugees who were coming in, who spoke a language that simply wasn't in the top 10 languages that a city might allow. So what we actually did was create a partnership between them and a large private sector company that works on sentiment analysis and call centers to actually build a new model for how calls can be triaged, can be directed inside of the city, even when the person who's calling speaks a language that just isn't in the normal course of operations. These kinds of opportunities exist everywhere. And I think what I would suggest as a takeaway from this is not merely that an institution like ours is creating these partnerships, but the power to do so really sits in the hands of every technologist who's civically minded, of every person inside of a technology business who has connections to local business councils, to refugee, to vulnerable populations work, to social services, to say, if we can find an opportunity to do it, it's often costless to a private sector company and can lead to some really incredible community trust.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for sharing that. And again, congratulations on the WEF YGL. It's a formidable group of people, and I imagine you're going to meet some very, very interesting people, and who knows where that could lead for the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation as well.
Thank you so much. I am excited.
So, Vilas, what's it like being a foundation working in the field of AI? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
You know, I said to you that this role that I'm in might not be the most predictable one given my background. But I think what we found is there's an incredible set of institutions that are empowered to hold public capital and also to hold public trust. I think of institutions that built the field of public health in the 20th century, that have served as known names in philanthropy and in the social change sector. But I'll tell you that one of the things I noticed was not many of them were particularly robust on digital transformation. Often it felt like when we were trying to solve issues like poverty or childhood malnutrition, the toolkit that social change actors had looked very different from what my colleagues had in the private sector. And so we've set out to build a new kind of philanthropy. We call it a 21st century philanthropy. And we do three things, Jules, that really define what civil society's work might look like in the sector. The first is we realized we had to solve the fundamental problem of bridging technology's promise with nonprofits' capacity to do work. And as many philanthropies might do, our first attempt was to simply say, we'll write some checks to some organizations so that they can go and figure out how to be technically adept. But what we quickly learned, and I'm sure many of the technologists in the room are thinking about this and saying, wait, there's no pathway. We quickly learned there's no real pathway to do that. We actually had to step in a much more active way. And so what we did was we merged with the foundation of a technology company in one of the first philanthropic mergers in American history in the last 75 years. And we built a team of data scientists that work inside of the foundation that actually deliver direct services to our partners, that actually help them build great data sets that start from, let's take your very messy 20 years of data, curate it and bring it to a point where we can now begin to build predictive analytics and machine learning on top of it. And so this is our new model of working. We are in many ways a technology services company owned by a philanthropy that's operating at the level of taking organizations through a full transformation to a place where they can use AI in topics as varied as we've discussed climate change, we've talked about access to education. In one recent example, an organization out of the University of Chicago used these tools to analyze racial disparities in eviction rates across the country. And for the first time, we're able to demonstrate how these different forms of power were affecting these meaningful economic outcomes. And in the process, they won a Pulitzer Prize for their work. It's amazing to see how data is changing what these nonprofits do. And we sit and really try to build cross-organizational spaces around that. But that's maybe the most direct part of our work, right? And it's the thing that makes us feel most like a technology company. But there's two other areas of work that I'm really focused on. The next is thinking about how we bring the voice of communities and the vulnerable into the creation of new technologies. That happens through a few different mechanisms, through really trusted partnerships that we've built with the C-suites of major tech companies, with customers and activists across the country, with labor unions and others, and also with policymakers. We recently had a chance to bring a group of policymakers out to do a multi-day training session where we said, we understand that you're general day-to-day doesn't often involve language like foundation models or regression or machine learning. Let's take a little bit of time to build a common vernacular. And we can invest in helping policymakers not just understand the ways that scientists talk about their work, but also the ways that those things are going to influence policy over the next 20 years. And then the final part of our work that I find most fascinating, and I hope that those in our audience today have begun to think about. I mentioned public health a little bit earlier in my comments, and public health's a really fascinating question. I'll be very reductive in this description, but stay with me. If it was 1925 and you lived in a rural part of the United States and you had a chronic condition, or maybe you contracted something really devastating like polio, your primary resource of where you would go for care might be your village medical practitioner, who might be a trained doctor, but more often was somebody who held a lot of regular and local wisdom. But over the period of 25 years that followed that time, we built an entire structure of public health in this country. Everything from county boards of health to medical schools and certification boards, the National Institutes of Health and the CDC, or at least the precursors of those institutions. Now, that's an example that I share with you from a historical perspective, but I often think about the world we have today, where AI and data systems are transforming power in ways that we don't even have vocabulary for yet. For citizens who are engaging with information and misinformation out in the world, for governments that are delivering digital services, for companies that are opening new markets, I wonder if we're in a period where we need to begin to build new institutions for a digital age. A world that technology companies can definitely be a part of. But when I ask questions like, who will ensure that new algorithms being built have been audited for fairness and transparency? When we ask fundamental questions about who will act as a fiduciary and a steward for data for vulnerable people? Who in the government will be capable of understanding the competitiveness factors that result from AI? These are all measures that require new forms of civic institutions. And while AI scientists will be a significant part of that, we also need to build in political scientists and philosophers, people who focus on the human sciences and understand the anthropological and sociological frames in which we operate. This is really exciting work. And for folks who like building things, whether it's algorithms or software or hardware, this is building social institutions and new ways of working and ways of protecting the vulnerable and creating new fairness.
I love that, the idea of creating new institutions for the digital age. I think that's kind of something to really go away and think about. Vilas, okay, my next question for you, I want to ask in 3 parts. And that is, firstly, how do you partner with the private sector? And how do you partner with governments? And how can we as consumers support the work of the foundation, and what's our role to play?
Sure. So 3 parts, let me take them in turn. With the private sector in particular, we are always inspired by the conversations we have, because the kinds of vision that are being held for the products that are possible shape for us an incredible new future for humanity. Our role in partnering with these organizations often is to bring 2 things. The first, a frame and a voice that ensures that we're centering populations and communities not merely as subjects of the technologies being built, but hopefully as folks who are influencing their direction, in bringing kind of more focus on community source design, on creating focus groups and engagement mechanisms, even in early days and certainly through alpha and beta testing, and in making sure that as those products come out, they fit with a certain framework of accountability and transparency, of fairness and value that meets the public need. We do that in partnership, in formal and informal partnership, in direct engagement with scientists and technologists. The second thing we do with the private sector is to act as a conduit and a connection point between nonprofit organizations that are building solutions at scale and the technology companies and the private sector institutions that can really deliver massive leverage. I think about things I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the fact that we are supporting an organization that will soon be launching a new satellite. And that satellite's primary purpose will be to give us the most granular view of methane emissions that we've ever had on planet Earth. That satellite will also generate terabytes or petabytes of data. So the questions on how do we make sure that that data is being brought into the world in a way that private sector organizations that often deal with data sets this size have tools to organize, to synthesize, and to draw out insight. And we act to connect those kinds of organizations together in meaningful ways. So we welcome always new friendships and connections and relationships with the private sector. With government, we take a slightly different role. As you might imagine, government, I think, has an incredible power, not just to regulate and control, but to inspire and invest. And we really sit on the latter part of that spectrum. While we've done things like advise new legislation that's coming out in the European Union, that's under consideration here in the United States on how to limit AI actors, what we're really focused on is how do we build mechanisms by which government can invest hundreds of millions, billions, and hundreds of billions of dollars into the creation of new fundamental AI compute capacity, of building new kind of investments into specific use cases, into supporting American competitiveness around the world. And because we're a global institution, supporting governments around the world also to build their own domestic capacity to build new solutions. It's worth it for me to share with you a couple of lines on what I think is one of the critical questions of the 21st century, which is how will the creation of these new tools promote and support democratic values? And how will they be used by governments that don't necessarily fit that model of governance to create more autocratic interventions, to create more surveillance, to create more restriction? There too, we take a voice in suggesting that if we believe in the idea of an equitable world for the future, we have to make sure the technologies we're building actually support democratic values and principles. And we take that stand in partnership with governments around the world. Finally, I think you asked, remind me the third part of your question, was it about civil society?
Yeah, but the third part was how can myself, our listeners, civil society, the man on the street, how can we interact with the foundation, and what role do we have to play in making sure that we leave a digital future that our children will be happy with?
Yeah, what a fantastic question. Look, at the end of the day, I've told you throughout, I'm an optimist, and sometimes I sound a little naive, but I will tell you once again, I believe with a deep conviction, change happens at the individual level. We talk about institutions, we talk about companies, but really we think about individuals who are change makers, who lead and work within those organizations. So a few thoughts for you. The first is if you are somebody who has the capacity to build these tools to really be an architect of the product, understand that there are so many organizations out there who would value your mentorship, your support, your technical advice, and your capacity. Know that if you are somebody who wants to support these organizations, this is no longer a matter of writing a check because of a fundraiser. It's often giving kind of the most interesting and useful parts of your expertise and wisdom to support organizations to build these kind of solutions. And then I also think a lot about the fact that the decisions that we face today, we've often given over control. We've said to governments, figure out how to adapt a regulatory environment for this work. We've said to tech companies, it's okay if your technology gets more and more intimate, if it crawls down our brainstem, if you will. And it's okay if it's a lot more alien, if I never will understand a line of code or how it works. Those are choices we've made almost by default and inertia. And the question I ask you, Jules, the question I ask our audience, and the question I ask every day in the world is that the way we think we create a better world? Or do we invest in educating our children to have a basic sense of digital literacy and making sure that we understand the decisions that are being taken on our behalf and that we lift up our voices in partnership with both those who understand the tech and those who understand the challenges we face to have a shared voice that says, let's do something a little bit different. Let's create a more inclusive future. Let's build technology that makes the world a better place.
Brilliant answer. And Vilas, you've mentioned healthcare as one example, but given you have this incredibly unique perspective on AI across many different industries, what are some of the industries where you're seeing some of the most progressive transformations that will benefit humanity?
In the private? Oh, of course. Well, look, I mean, often, and it's an interesting coda because I think so many of the transformations that are happening will make the world a better place. I start from the idea that a lot of manual and physical labor often is the subject of a conversation about displaced workers. And I like to say that those really dirty and dangerous jobs, I'm excited for those workers to be displaced. Often, particularly in the West, those jobs have been handled by the most vulnerable, by the most dispossessed, by the most economically insecure individuals. And I don't think that we should have people running presses and factories and mines at direct risk of life and limb when we know that a machine could do it. So let's start with disruption across the mechanical industrial base. And let's do it in a way that is truly responsible, that understands that when we displace a worker, that we have an obligation to create an opportunity for economic success for that individual and that class of workers. We need to invest in retraining and reskilling. And there too is another example of an industry that I think is being transformed by machine learning and AI. I think about new forms of training that use augmented reality combined with machine learning and natural language processing to take somebody who maybe has never seen a jet engine before and bring them to a level of competence as a mechanic in ways that are much faster than traditional education. We think about new forms of work and engagement that allow for people to bring new skill sets. So, for example, individuals who can be effective translators, who can be effective synthesis and creation activity workers, people who do what folks call human work, right? Things that require human capacity supported by machine systems. And then we think about advanced manufacturing as well, right? There, the question is less about displacement. It's more about building in efficiencies, about new material science and drug discovery that are being absolutely disrupted by AI, that are leading to the identification of new compounds and the synthesis of new fibers that will allow us to build greater and bigger things than we've ever built, and at the same time solve critical human diseases. It's a funny question because if you ask me, where do we see this disruption? The answer is quite literally everywhere. The question for us will just be, as we create new possibilities, who will control and who will benefit from them? And that's just something that we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Vilas, thank you so much. I've learned so much today and look forward to hunting you down at the next Davos and hopefully learning some more over a cup of tea or coffee. But as my final question, on behalf of all of our listeners and also everyone at Scale and TransformX, given your very high-level perspective on AI and how it's hopefully going to benefit humanity in the future, what is the one takeaway you would like this audience to focus on from this conversation? And what's the kind of pay it forward that we make sure that we come away from this talk and remember and take action?
Yeah, it's quite an easy answer, Jules. So thank you for asking. At the end of the day, the answer is we have to take agency and control over the decisions that we make about technology. That I think there's an inevitability to the fact that we will continue to build what a 9-year-old me would have called the coolest new toy. There isn't necessarily an inevitability to the idea that that new toy will help humanity. We have to step in with good intention, with the support of consumers and stakeholders and executives and CEOs, and we have to make sure that we fundamentally ask the question, where do we invest to create better tech for a better world? I look forward to seeing you at Davos, but also to those folks in our audience. Always very happy to engage on social media. I'm easy to find on Twitter at Vilas Dhar. And please contact the foundation if there's work that we can do in collaboration.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Vilas Dhar, everybody. And a huge thank you to both you and the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation on behalf of TransformX. It's been such a pleasure to have you and to talk to you today.
Jules, thank you so much. What a delight.
Awesome.